This is about a fundamental shift in how America projects power, enforces sanctions, and dictates who controls one of the world's largest oil reserves. And here's what makes this so critical. We're watching the real-time construction of a naval blockade that experts say violates international law, threatens global energy security, and could send shockwaves through markets from Beijing to Houston. Today, we're breaking down three critical questions. What exactly happened in this latest seizure? Who's really affected by this escalating blockade? And what are the long-term consequences for energy markets and international law? Let's get straight to what happened. In the pre-dawn hours of Friday, January 9th, 2026, U.S. Marines and Navy sailors launched from the USS Gerald R. Ford, America's most technologically advanced aircraft carrier, to board and seize the Olena oil tanker in the Caribbean Sea near Trinidad. According to U.S. Southern Command, forces apprehended the vessel without incident. Though dramatic footage posted by Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem shows armed personnel using explosive devices to breach doors on the ship. The Olena represents the fifth tanker seized in just 22 days, a rapid escalation that began shortly after U.S. forces conducted a controversial military operation on January 3rd to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro from Caracas. The vessel was carrying an estimated 890,000 barrels of oil, valued at approximately $53 million at current market prices of around $60 per barrel. But here's where it gets more complicated. U.S. government records reveal Olena was previously sanctioned under its former name, the Minerva M, for transporting Russian oil. International shipping registries now show the tanker flying a false flag from Timor-Leste, a tiny Southeast Asian nation, while its automatic identification system tracker had been dark, turned off for 52 days, last transmitting its location in November in Venezuelan waters northeast of Curacao. And it gets worse. This tanker was part of a flotilla of approximately a dozen vessels that departed Venezuela last week, all loaded with oil, attempting to break through the U.S. naval blockade. According to industry sources with direct knowledge, the Olena had actually left Venezuelan waters, then turned around and was heading back fully loaded after realizing the extent of the American blockade. 7 additional tankers from that same flotilla also reversed course on Friday and Saturday, heading back to Venezuelan ports rather than risk interdiction. Pentagon spokesperson Sean Parnell declared on social media that in just 24 hours, at least 7 dark fleet oil vessels turned around to avoid interdiction because they know we mean business. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth made it crystal clear the U.S. blockade of sanctioned Venezuelan oil remains in full effect anywhere in the world, not just in the Caribbean, anywhere on the planet. So what exactly is happening here? And how did we get to this point? Let's break down the mechanics of this unprecedented operation. First, understand what a shadow fleet actually means. These are vessels that operate with little to no regulation, often with unknown insurance, false flags, and deliberately disabled tracking systems. Venezuela has become increasingly dependent on these ships since U.S. sanctions intensified. According to Al Jazeera's reporting from Bogota, approximately 40% of tankers operating from Venezuela have been sanctioned, forcing the country to rely on this shadow fleet to export oil, with most shipments heading to China. The timeline here is crucial. On January 3rd, 2026, U.S. Special Forces conducted a military raid on Caracas, capturing President Maduro in what has been widely condemned as a violation of international law. 4 United Nations experts stated in December that the U.S. has no right to enforce unilateral sanctions through an armed blockade, calling it illegal armed aggression under international law. Yet within days of Maduro's capture, President Trump announced that the United States would indefinitely control Venezuela's oil sales and called on American oil companies to repair what he termed Venezuela's rotting energy infrastructure. The military assets being deployed are staggering. The USS Gerald R. Ford, commissioned in 2017 at a cost exceeding $13 billion, is the Navy's newest and most advanced carrier. It serves as the launching platform for Joint Task Force Southern Spear, the operational command conducting these seizures. Coast Guard cutters, working in coordination with the Department of Homeland Security, are conducting the actual boardings, supported by Marine assault teams. Here's the kicker. This isn't just about stopping illegal oil shipments. Trump himself has been remarkably candid about the actual objective. In multiple statements, he's declared that Venezuela unilaterally seized American oil assets and platforms costing billions of dollars, and that the U.S. intends to take control of the country's vast oil reserves. Venezuela possesses an estimated 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest in the world, surpassing even Saudi Arabia. But there's a massive problem with this strategy, and it's one that energy analysts are increasingly pointing out. Venezuela's current oil production has dropped to approximately 800,000 barrels per day due to the blockade and years of underinvestment and mismanagement. That represents just 1% of global oil supply. The country's oil infrastructure is badly deteriorated, and experts estimate it would require tens of billions of dollars in investment and 5 to 10 years to restore production to historical levels of 3 million barrels per day. And here's where it impacts global markets directly. Most of Venezuela's oil exports, approximately 60 to 65%, were going to China before this blockade intensified. While Venezuelan oil represents only about 4% of China's total imports, Venezuela depends almost entirely on Chinese purchases. This creates what economists call asymmetric dependency. China can find alternative suppliers relatively easily. Venezuela cannot find alternative buyers, especially not with U.S. warships intercepting tankers in international waters. Russia has also been deeply involved in Venezuelan oil operations. The fourth tanker seized just days before the Olena was the Russian-flagged Marinera, originally known as the Bella 1, which was pursued by the Coast Guard for weeks before being interdicted in the North Atlantic. Russia condemned that seizure as a gross violation of international maritime law and demanded the release of the crew. The U.S. Department of Justice responded by announcing it would investigate the crew for failing to comply with Coast Guard orders and pursue criminal charges. The legal framework the U.S. is using to justify these actions centers on sanctions violations. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, maintains a sanctions list that includes both Venezuelan state oil company PDVSA and specific vessels. The Treasury Department sanctioned the Olena, then operating as Minerva M, in January 2025 as part of the Shadow Fleet facilitating sanctionable activity. But here's the critical question that international law experts are raising. Does the United States have the legal authority to enforce its own unilateral sanctions through military force in international waters against vessels flagged by third countries? The comparison to historical precedents is striking. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, President Kennedy implemented a naval quarantine of Cuba, but he sought and received authorization from the Organization of American States and notified the United Nations Security Council. The current Venezuela blockade has no such multilateral authorization. It's a unilateral American action being conducted under the justification of enforcing U.S. domestic law on the high seas. So who exactly is affected by this escalating blockade? Let's break it down by category because the impacts are far more widespread than most Americans realize. For American consumers, the immediate effects are counterintuitive. You might think that controlling Venezuelan oil would lower gas prices, but experts say that's unlikely in the short term. The global oil market is currently experiencing oversupply, with prices already relatively soft. Venezuela's degraded production capacity means that even if U.S. companies gain access, it would take years of massive investment before significant new supply reaches American refineries. In fact, some analysts warn that the geopolitical uncertainty created by the blockade could actually add a risk premium to oil prices. American oil and gas companies are in a complicated position. Trump held a meeting with energy executives at the White House on Friday, urging them to invest in rebuilding Venezuela's infrastructure. But here's the reality these companies face. Venezuela's heavy crude requires specialized refining capacity. Its oil fields need extensive rehabilitation. The political and legal risks are enormous. Would investments be protected if a future Venezuelan government or future U.S. administration changes policy? And perhaps most importantly, with global oil markets already oversupplied, is there actually demand for expensive to produce Venezuelan heavy crude? For small and medium-sized businesses dependent on stable energy prices, the uncertainty is creating planning nightmares. Supply chain managers can't predict whether oil prices will spike from geopolitical tensions or remain subdued from oversupply. Companies that use petroleum-based materials or rely on transportation are stuck in a holding pattern, unable to confidently forecast costs for the next quarter, let alone the next year. The impacts on Venezuela itself are devastating. With tankers unable to export oil, the country's already collapsed economy faces complete paralysis. Venezuela depends on oil exports for approximately 95% of its foreign currency earnings. Every tanker that turns around rather than risk seizure means millions of dollars in lost revenue. That translates directly to the Venezuelan people, who already face shortages of food, medicine, and basic necessities. Reports from Caracas indicate fuel shortages are worsening, even though Venezuela sits atop the world's largest oil reserves, an almost incomprehensible irony. China faces significant strategic challenges. While Venezuelan oil represents only 4% of Chinese imports, the precedent being established is alarming to Beijing. If the United States can simply seize vessels carrying sanctioned oil in international waters, what prevents similar actions against Iranian tankers heading to China or Russian energy shipments? China has condemned the U.S. actions and accused Washington of threatening global energy security. The seizures also impact Venezuela's ability to repay an estimated $10 to $12 billion in debt owed to Chinese entities, primarily China Development Bank. Russia's response has been fierce. Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova called the seizure of the Russian-flagged Marinera a brazen act of piracy and demanded immediate release of the crew. Moscow views these interdictions as part of a broader American effort to dominate global energy flows and punish countries that refuse to align with U.S. foreign policy. The incident adds another layer of tension to an already fraught U.S.-Russia relationship. International shipping companies and insurers are reassessing risk calculations. If vessels can be seized in international waters for carrying cargo that the United States unilaterally declares illegal, what does that mean for freedom of navigation and international maritime law? Lloyd's List, the global shipping intelligence service, reports that insurance premiums for vessels with any connection to Venezuelan or Russian oil have increased substantially, in some cases doubling or tripling. And here's what should concern everyone. 4 United Nations independent human rights experts have stated that the blockade represents a violation of Venezuelan citizens' right to self-determination. If the international community allows one country to impose its domestic law extraterritorially through military force, what precedent does that establish for future conflicts? Legal experts and policy analysts are raising serious concerns about both the immediate actions and long-term implications. Professor Mary Ellen O'Connell, an international law expert at Notre Dame Law School, told journalists that while the U.S. has the right to enforce its own sanctions within its territory and against its own nationals, the extension of those sanctions through military force on the high seas against third country vessels is legally questionable at best. Energy economist Francisco Monaldi from Rice University's Baker Institute pointed out a fundamental contradiction in the Trump administration's approach. He noted that if the goal is to increase global oil supply and reduce prices, creating massive uncertainty and risk around Venezuelan production is counterproductive. Major oil companies need legal clarity, political stability, and protected property rights before committing tens of billions in investment. Right now, they have none of those things. The political reactions have divided along predictable lines, but with some surprising crosscurrents. Republican Senator Marco Rubio praised the seizures as long overdue enforcement of sanctions against the criminal Maduro regime. Democratic Senator Chris Murphy, however, warned that while Maduro is clearly an authoritarian, the military operation to capture him and the ongoing blockade raised serious questions about America's commitment to international law and multilateral institutions. If we don't follow the rules, why should China or Russia? Looking at the short-term consequences over the next 30 to 90 days, several scenarios appear likely. First, expect Venezuela's oil exports to drop substantially, perhaps by 40 to 50%, as tanker operators decide the risk of seizure outweighs potential profits. Second, China will almost certainly accelerate efforts to develop alternative supply chains and payment mechanisms that bypass U.S.-controlled systems. Third, diplomatic negotiations between the U.S. and an interim Venezuelan government will determine whether American oil companies can actually begin operations, but don't expect quick results given the complexity. In the medium term, looking 6 to 12 months ahead, the situation could evolve in dramatically different directions. If U.S. companies do enter Venezuela and begin investing billions in infrastructure repairs, we might see the beginning of a long-term production recovery, though it would take years to reach meaningful volumes. But there's an equally plausible scenario where legal challenges, continued unrest in Venezuela, and lack of international recognition of U.S. control create a frozen situation where Venezuela's oil remains largely offline, benefiting neither American companies nor Venezuelan citizens. The wildcard factor is how other oil-producing nations respond. If OPEC members, particularly Saudi Arabia, view U.S. control of Venezuelan reserves as a threat to their market influence, they might adjust their own production to prevent American companies from profiting. Alternatively, if global demand strengthens and Venezuelan supply remains offline, we could see tighter markets and rising prices, exactly the opposite of what Trump promised. So let's recap the three most critical takeaways from this developing situation. First, the United States has seized 5 oil tankers in just 3 weeks, establishing an unprecedented naval blockade that international law experts say violates maritime law. Second, the impacts extend far beyond Venezuela, affecting U.S. consumers, energy companies, China, Russia, and the entire framework of international shipping. And third, the long-term consequences remain deeply uncertain, with scenarios ranging from renewed Venezuelan oil production under U.S. company management to a prolonged crisis that destabilizes global energy markets. Here's the bottom line. We're witnessing a fundamental test of whether military power can override international law in pursuit of economic objectives. The answer to that question will shape geopolitics for decades to come. What do you think? Does the United States have the legal and moral authority to seize vessels in international waters to enforce its own sanctions? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to stay informed on stories the mainstream media won't fully cover, make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell icon so you never miss an analysis. The world's energy future might be decided not in boardrooms or diplomatic conferences, but by warships on the high seas. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.